sincere greetings to everyone watching this video. We, the members of Team 6, are here to present on the novel In Search of April Raintree by Beatrice Mosionier. In Search of April Raintree by Beatrice Mosionier is a powerful novel that follows the lives of two Métis sisters, April and Cheryl, who were separated from their parents and placed in foster care. Through their contrasting experiences, April's attempts to assimilate into white society and Cheryl's deep pride in her indigenous identity, the novel tries to explore themes of racism, identity, trauma, and resilience. Set in Canada, it offers a moving critique of colonial systems and a struggle to reclaim cultural roots. Now, let us venture further into the novel.
Hey everyone, I'm Kanashka. Today we are diving into Wounds and Words, Trauma and Healing in Beatrice Mosionier, In Search of April Raintree. We will explore how this powerful story of two Métis sisters shows the impact of trauma and the journey towards healing. Let's get started. As In Search of April Raintree draws to a close, we are left with more than just the story of two sisters. We are left with the meditation on survival, memory, and the possibility of healing in the world marked by loss. Beatrice doesn't offer us comfort, she offers truth, the kind of truth that lingers, that unsettles, that asks us to look again at the history we inherit and the silence we sustain. Through April and Cheryl, we see how trauma moves through generations like an echo, shaping how people love, how they see themselves, and how they carry the past. Yet, even in the pain, Beatrice reveals a quiet defiance, the will to keep speaking, to keep remembering, to keep existing despite erasure. Storytelling in this sense becomes more than art. It becomes survival. Every word April tells, every memory Cheryl holds becomes a thread that binds what was broken. And in that act of telling, something begins to heal. Not fully, not perfectly, but meaningfully. Beatrice reminds us that to heal, we must remember. And to remember, we must listen. Her work stands as both witness and warning, reminding us that consolation begins not in forgetting, but in the brave confrontation of pain. And perhaps that's the lasting gift of In Search of April Raintree. The recognition that healing is not the absence of scars, but the ability to live with them, to let them teach us compassion, strength, and truth.
Hello all, this is Mira. Beatrice Mosonier's In Search of April Raintree explores Métis identity through two sisters, April and Cheryl. Their contrasting paths tend to symbolize two key responses to colonial pressures. One is urban assimilation and the other is cultural pride. This duality tends to reflect the wider Métis experience of negotiating between indigenous heritage and Euro-Canadian society. Post-colonial and trauma theories help us to understand how their identities are shaped, fragmented, and reshaped. April represents urban assimilation. Separated from her family and raised in foster care, she grows ashamed of her Métis background. She changes her name, alters her appearance, and adapts to dominant cultural norms to fit into white society. This reflects Frantz Fanon's idea of the epidermalization of inferiority, where colonized people internalize racism and try to mirror the colonizer. April's light skin allows her to pass, but this comes with fear, shame, and a fractured sense of self. Her choices are shaped by colonial institutions that reward assimilation, making it more of a survival strategy rather than empowering. Cheryl, on the other hand, embodies cultural pride and resistance. She researches Métis history, writes about indigenous struggles, and proudly identifies with her community. This aligns with Ngugi wa Thiong'o's call to reclaim suppressed histories as acts of decolonization and Gayatri Spivak's idea of the subaltern speaking. Cheryl gives voice to marginalized narratives, asserting Métis identity as valid and powerful. However, her pride is entwined with intergenerational trauma and systemic marginalization. Lacking social support, she eventually succumbs to emotional distress, reflecting the painful consequences of resisting colonial structures. Together, April and Cheryl symbolize Métis duality. One seeks survival through assimilation, the other through cultural reclamation. Their stories reveal the tensions of living in a colonial society where neither choice guarantees belonging or safety. Through their lives, Mosionier shows that Métis identity exists in a hybrid, contested space, caught between erasure and resistance.
Hello everyone, I am Ravina and my topic is on the representation of indigenous women in the novel In Search of April Raintree. This work gives a powerful and emotional voice to indigenous women, especially Métis women, who have often been silenced and misrepresented in the Canadian history and literature. Throughout the story of two sisters, April and Cheryl Raintree, the author explores how colonialism, racism, and social exclusion shapes their lives and identities. Historically, indigenous women face double discrimination, both as a women and as a members of colonized communities. They were the victims of systems like residential schools, forced assimilation, and cultural discrimination. These experiences cause deep emotional wounds and loss of identity. Drawing from her own Métis background, the author turns her novel into both a story and a tool for truth-telling and healing. The two sisters in the novel respond to oppression in a very different ways. April, hurt by racism and sexual violence, tries to hide her Métis identity in order to be accepted by the white society. This shows how colonialism can make a people feel ashamed and who they are. Cheryl, however, profoundly embraces Métis roots and dreams of helping her people through education, activism, but her dreams are shattered by the harsh realities of racism and gendered roles. Through April and Cheryl, the author shows how indigenous women are not just the victims but the survivors, strong, compassionate, and determined to reclaim their identity. The novel also reveals broader issues like inequality, intergenerational trauma, and the lack of justice for indigenous women. In the end of the novel is more than just a story of two sisters. It is a call for recognition, respect, and understanding of indigenous women's struggles and strength. The author reminds us that their stories deserve to be heard and their resilience deserve to be celebrated. Thank you.
Struggle of identity. Beatrice Mosionier's In Search of April Raintree begins with two Métis sisters, April and Cheryl, who are placed in foster care. This separation cuts them off from their family and their cultural roots, leaving them searching for a sense of identity and belonging. April, because of her lighter skin, tries to pass as white, believing that assimilation will protect her from discrimination. But this attempt to belong in mainstream society comes at the cost of distancing herself from her true heritage. Cheryl, on the other hand, embraces her Métis identity with pride. She studies her history and refuses to hide her background, but this courage comes with consequences. She faces racism, prejudice, and rejection, showing how difficult it is to remain true to oneself in a society that refuses acceptance. Belonging versus alienation. The sisters' experiences highlight the painful contrast between belonging and alienation. Belonging is not simply about fitting in, but about being accepted for who you truly are. April learns that denying her indigenous background does not bring her security, as society continues to stereotype and exclude her own truth is known. Cheryl, however, finds dignity and self-worth in her cultural pride, but she too is alienated by mainstream society, which refuses to value her on her own terms. Mosionier shows us how racism and colonial attitudes force both sisters into cycles of alienation, even when they long for belonging. This struggle takes a heavy psychological toll, shaping their identities, their relationships, and ultimately their destinies. Wider message. On a larger scale, April and Cheryl's stories reflect the collective alienation faced by Indigenous people in Canada. Colonization, systemic racism, and the foster care system have all worked to sever Indigenous communities from their land, families, and culture. Yet, the novel also points to the possibility of healing. April's eventual recognition and acceptance of her Métis identity symbolize the importance of reclaiming one's culture and resisting assimilation. Mosionier's message is powerful. True belonging cannot be achieved through denial. It must come from affirming identity, heritage, and community even in the face of oppression. Belonging in this sense becomes not just survival but also an act of resistance, while alienation is exposed as a tool of colonial control.
Hello everyone, I'm Rajati and I'm going to talk about racism and identity crisis in Beatrice Coltron in Search of April Raintree. Let's talk about racism and colonial clays. From childhood, April faces racism in foster care. Her white foster parents and teachers treat her as inferior because she is Métis. And also, she was mocked by her classmates for her darker skin and her racial identity. She begins to deny herself and she strives to become a white by wearing makeup. This can be compared to Homike Baba's the term mimicry, and also, according to Frantz Fanon, colonized people often internalize racism and want to become the colonizer. And also, Edward said that a white gaze defines her identity. For example, April says that she prefers to be called as April Rain instead of April Raintree. By removing her Métis status from her name, this is a clear act of self-erasure caused by racism. Let's move on to identity crisis and assimilation. To assimilate into the white culture, she gets educated, dresses fashionably, and even marries a white man named Bob Radcliffe, believing this will give her self-respect. This reflects Stuart Hall's idea of identity being both becoming and being. This sense of in-betweenness is what post-colonial critics call as hybridity. It was said by Homike Baba. Even after Cheryl's death, April admits that she has always run away from who she was and showing her painful realization of alienation and loss of self. And although there's a contrast between Cheryl and collective trauma, Cheryl, April's sister, reacts differently. She embraces her Métis identity, studies her people's history and feels proud of her roots. But her pride clashes with harsh systemic racism. This results in poverty, neglect, and prejudice. April's denial of identity results in personal emptiness, and Cheryl's acceptance of identity results in social punishment. This reflects Bell Hooks' idea that marginality is both pain and possibility. Cheryl's death and April's later realization symbolize the collective trauma of indigenous people and struggle between shame and pride. Even for the example, Cheryl's suicide note reminds April of their shared heritage and pain, pushing April to finally accept who she is as a Métis woman. To conclude, what I would like to say is, April's search is both personal and political, which mirrors the search for indigenous selfhood in a white-dominated world. Mosionier message: real freedom begins when one accepts their root and rejects the colonial definition of worth. Thank you.
Beatrice Mosonier's In Search of April Raintree powerfully exposes the lasting impact of the 60s coup, a policy through which thousands of indigenous children were taken from their families between the 1950s and 1980s. Like residential schools before it, this system claimed to protect indigenous children, but instead worked to erase their language, culture, and identity. The 60s coup was portrayed as an act of welfare, but it was actually a form of colonial violence. Indigenous families were labeled unfit and their children were placed in white homes to be civilized. In Mosionier's novel, this policy becomes personal. April and Cheryl, two petty sisters, are separated from their parents and forced into foster care. This story shows how the scope didn't just remove children, it destroyed families and erased entire cultural lineages. The sisters' lives reflect the painful conflict between identity and survival. April tries to pass as white, believing it will protect her from racism, while Cheryl embraces her Metis roots with pride. Both paths lead to suffering. April faces shame and self-denial, while Cheryl is crushed by a society that rejects her indigenous identity. Their experiences show how colonial racism works both externally through discrimination and internally through self-rejection. Mosionier also shows how this colonial system targeted indigenous women specifically. April's rape by white men who call her squaw reveals how racism and sexism combine to justify violence against indigenous women. The body becomes another site of colonization, controlled and violated and silenced. Cheryl's eventual death further exposes the deep psychological wounds left by these forms of abuse. Through the sister's story, Mosionier reveals the violence of the 60s coup doesn't end with one generation. It continues through inherited trauma, broken families, and lost identity. Yet, there's also resistance. After Cheryl's death, April begins to reconnect with her Metis heritage, realizing that healing starts with remembering. Her acceptance of who she is becomes an act of defiance against a system that tries to erase her. In Search of April, Raintree transforms personal pain into collective memory. By telling the story, Mosionier gives voice to the silence by colonialism and shows that storytelling itself can be a form of healing. The novel reminds us that survival, truth, and remembrance are not just personal victories, they are acts of resistance against the violence of history.
In Search of April, Raintree powerfully shows the struggles of identity, racism, and resilience. April's journey teaches us that accepting who we are and being proud of our roots leads to healing and strength. The novel ends with hope and self-discovery. I sincerely thank all my group members, Anicham, Aarti, Kanishka, Mira, Rajati, and Ravina for their wonderful contribution. Thank you.